Hello, my name is Michael Davis, and welcome to Constitutional Day in Nashua, New Hampshire. These events are being sponsored by the New Hampshire Center for Constitutional Studies. Our next speaker is Pastor Garrett Lear. Pastor Garrett Lear will be doing a talk, No Freedom of Press, and the question mark. Pastor Lear has been known as New Hampshire's own Patriot pastor. He is the founder of Well of the Living Water Church and president of his own faith-based counseling service, Wise Counsel. Pastor Garrett Lear is a longtime champion for the rights of the unborn and for reconnecting the American people to the biblical roots of the American Republic. Pastor Lear is a longtime contributor to Constitutional Day. And now I'd like to introduce to you Pastor Garrett Lear.
Well, among the amendments to the Constitution of the United States, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Well, or of the press, which is number 4 of those 6 unalienable rights, which are specified in this particular amendment, the First Amendment, which our founding fathers and the framers of our constitutional republic chose to delineate first out of the other unalienable rights given to us by our Creator, not privileges doled out to us at the fiat and according to the will of men. It's important that we understand that. And these constitutional protections are codified that American government would be defined and chained to these supreme laws of the land, unique in all history and unique in regards to other countries. Now, in the Declaration of Independence, which I like to call the Declaration of American Independence, I want to draw your attention particularly to the fact that it says unalienable rights. We're going to talk about that a little bit. And this is going to be a different discussion, perhaps, than most of you have heard or perhaps thought of. It's a different, but I would contend with you that it is a more accurate view because it is a historical view from the original intent of the founders. So if we Americans have been given or blessed with unalienable rights by our Creator, shouldn't we first inquire of Him why He would want us to be given these rights or for us to have these rights? And here, in the Bible, and this is the first foundation for the freedom of the press, by the way, and that probably might be shocking to many people today. They don't realize that actually freedom of press is a biblical foundation. And for example, if you were to read in the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus, you may recognize that to be where the Ten Commandments, one of the places of the Ten Commandments is in verse 16, in the King James Version, which is predominantly the version that our founding fathers were very fluent in and read. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Number 9 of the 10 Commandments that God published on tablets of stone. Remember, I said published on tablets of stone so the people would know. It's the first instance, really, of freedom of press, and with the real purpose that the people should know. Keep that in mind as we go through today's session. The second verse that I'd like to bring out is 2 Kings chapter 22 at verse 8. Says, I found a book of the law in the house of the Lord. And King Josiah said, I did not know. This needs to get to the people. So what happened was, after a period of time that the law of the Lord had become obscure and got lost, one day one of the priests found written out God's law and acquainted the king with it, and he said the people need to know. That was freedom of press. And in John 8:32, one of the most important verses that probably we're looking at, it says, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free, which incidentally is what I call the Patriot's motto, which is veritas vos liberabit. And so there are many other scriptures I could quote, but in the interest of time, let's just say that our founding fathers were very literate in the Bible, and they knew these stories well, and they were influenced by them in their crafting of our organic founding documents and charters. They were also very cognizant of the historical abuses of these people, or of the people, I should say, when the press was not free. Now, I'm going to give a little historical overview, and please bear with me here without covering every century since creation, which we don't have the time to do, but in particular in the times and events that had the greatest influence on the foundational era of America. A man named John Wycliffe. In 1382, he was persecuted for wanting Englishmen to be able to read and read the Bible in their own language. Freedom of press. And a very important milestone in history that many people today are not familiar with was Johann Gutenberg. And in 1436, he began working on his movable type printing press. Finished it in 1450, which actually marks the end of the Dark Ages and what was called the medieval or the Middle Ages, ending years of hand scribing, in other words, hand copying things, which of course there was a big expense in hand scribing, plus it meant that there had to be some wealthy person, and in most cases somebody that had an objective that wasn't necessarily the objective of we the people, so to speak. And so freedom of press has a great amount to owe to the movable type printing press invented by Gutenberg. And what was the very first book ever to come off of Gutenberg's printing press? Many people don't know this either. It was actually the Bible in the Latin Vulgate. Then we move on in history to a very bleak time called the Spanish Inquisition, which ran actually from 1478 till 1834. Our founding fathers were well acquainted of the lack of freedom of press, the lack of freedom of information during that bleak period of time. Then we move on to a little Augustinian priest named Martin Luther, who posted in 1517. He actually was persecuted for printing the truth, and he posted the 95 theses on the doors of Wittenberg. And he was greatly persecuted throughout his life for this. And he said, "If I declare with the loudest voice every portion of God's truth except for that one bit which the world and the devil are at the moment attacking, I am not confessing Christ, no matter how boldly I may be professing Christ. For the soldier to be steady on the battlefield, besides, is mere flight and disgrace if he flinches at that single point." We owe a lot to Martin Luther, and our founding fathers were well acquainted with his work. And then there was William Tyndale in 1534, who was executed for heresy. And what was his crime? For translating the Bible for general distribution in the common language of the people, English, against the wishes of a king named King Henry VIII. Now, I want to move ahead. That was just a brief glimpse, just a snapshot there to show you some foundational history that influenced our founding fathers. So as we move on to, let's say, the pre-Revolutionary War, or what I like to call the War for American Independence, we look at the sermons of American preachers. And I stand here today dressed in this costume to remind you of a period of time where we had a group of people called the Black Regiment. They were called that by King George III because they believed in freedom of press, and they believed in telling the truth even if the king didn't like it. And so many of these preachers, their sermons were printed, and they were distributed widely. And of course, the English king, as far back as 1730, didn't like that, because they mostly spoke against the divine right of kings, and that when a king would become tyrannical, he needed to be removed. And of course, the English king didn't like that. Amongst the people who sat in these congregations and heard this kind of preaching, for people like, for example, Jonathan Mayhew. In Boston, he had in his congregation John Hancock, Samuel Adams. These people were well schooled in this kind of theology and this kind of teaching, and it was foundational to the establishment of the American Republic. We also had people like John Leland and James Caldwell, Samuel West, and Samuel West was pastor to another great patriot of the foundational era named Patrick Henry. And then, of course, William Emerson, who was the grandfather of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and one of my favorites, Jonas Clark, who was the pastor, the village parson in the village of Lexington at the time of the Battle of Lexington, April 19th, 1775. Now, you would have been paid a handsome bounty if you would have turned them in, these members of the Black Regiment who believed so much in the freedom of press, to bring out the truth. They spoke against, as I said, the divine rights of kings. They also spoke of the right of the people to rebel against tyrants. So the Declaration of Independence was and is a published and printed, signed affidavit document. Think about that. Under the Freedom of Information Act, which, of course, at the time, King George didn't allow. But in paragraph 1, line 4, they should declare, publish the causes. In paragraph 2, line 15, to prove this, let facts be submitted, which meant published or printed, to a candid world. Of the 27 indictments against the British King and the government, indictment 4, he has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. So much for Freedom of Information Act or public notice in those days, and that was one of the complaints that is registered in the Declaration. Now, the Committees of Correspondence, I don't know that many people have heard of them, but in a sense, the Committees of Correspondence in that time, in the War for American Independence, during that era, was like the free press. And they were, in a sense, like the internet of the day, that even in 2006, that so much information is conveyed over the internet. And I bring to your attention one of the most important documents that was published on February 14, 1776. It was called Common Sense by Thomas Paine. He said, there is something exceedingly ridiculous in the composition of monarchy. It first excludes a man from the means of information, yet empowers him to act in cases where the highest form of judgment is required. Would the American government today, and here's a question for you, would the American government today allow this to be printed and distributed? Would corporate America publish it? And remember that many people read that, and it was foundational to their involvement in the War for American Independence. Now, what did our founders think about our responsibilities, the necessity of a free flow of information and the freedom of the press? Well, let's hear what George Washington had to say about our responsibilities. He said, the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered deeply, perhaps as finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. Still true today. And Patrick Henry, in his Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech, many people are familiar with the title without knowing the speech itself, he said, it is only in this way that we can hope to arrive at truth and fulfill the great responsibility which we hold to God and our country. Should I keep back my opinions at such a time through fear of giving offense, I should consider myself as guilty of treason towards my country and of an act of disloyalty towards the majesty of heaven, which I revere above all earthly kings. And what about James Madison? He said, a popular government without popular information, or the means of acquiring it, is but a prologue to a farce or tragedy, or perhaps both. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power. That's right, the power which knowledge gives. The eyes of the world being thus on our country, it is put the more on its good behavior and under the great obligation also to do justice to the tree of liberty by an exhibition of the fine fruits we gather from it. So, do you think he was endorsing political correctness, propaganda, or half-truth? I don't think so. I know he wasn't. And Thomas Jefferson, he said, I have sworn an oath upon the altar of God, eternal hostility to every form of tyranny over the mind of man. I would rather be exposed to the inconveniences attending to too much liberty than those attending to too small a degree of it. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what was and never will be. Our liberty depends on the freedom of the press, and that cannot be limited without being lost. Benjamin Franklin, he said, those who would give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. It's interesting what you learn when you go to their quotes and what they said. And then there's a group of people I call the mythstorians. The word myth combined with history, mythstorians, those revisionists that do not stay with the actual account, and those that change history to suit their partisan, sectarian, or perverse beliefs. Freedom of press is not pornography, lies, or deliberate omissions. The original intent of the founders was the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God, which of course the understanding of man's legitimate shortcomings in that respect, and sometimes poor eyesight. Adam Smith, that wrote the book The Wealth of Nations, said, caveat emptor, which is a Latin word for buyer beware. We must have the facts and make sure you check yours, by the way. The atrocities of tyrannical dictatorships, whether it was the communists, socialists, fascists, or all human abuse, or I should say human rights abusing regimes, always begins with a controlled media. Often their first acts in seizing power are to stop freedom of the press. We've seen that historically, the Nazis under Hitler, the Russians under people like Lenin, Marx, Stalin, Khrushchev, Romania under Ceausescu, China under Chairman Mao. They're all some recent examples of limiting and eliminating freedom of the press. Today, the press may include films, television, radio, videos, newspapers, magazines, books, libraries, and the internet. In 2006, is there really free press in America as the founders intended? That's an important question that I want you to deal with today. And then along with that, after all, the First Amendment freedom of press right was to prevent the press from being censored and we the people from not having access to the truth. In 1915, J.P. Morgan gathered 12 men high up in the newspaper industry to select the most influential U.S. newspapers and so as to control the general policy of the press in America. They identified 179 papers and determined that it would take the control of 25. And of course, what was their objective? Basically suppression of everything in opposition to the interests served. People such as a financier named Bernard Baruch controlled the U.S. News and World Report, Simon & Schuster, Vogue, Vanity Fair, Scribner, Wall Street Journal, Prentice Hall. You probably recognize all those names. Well, in a book called Censored 2006 in Chapter 6, it says in a listing of media ownership, it's a monopoly. In 1985, there were 50 substantial media conglomerates. Now there are 10 with connections to government, higher education, banking, and corporate America. Conglomerates such as Disney, Gannett, CBS Corporation, New York Times, Washington Post, Knight Ridder, Tribune Company, GE, News Corp. They share board members with a number of large corporations. These media owners and their editors act as an unelected, unaccountable disseminators of all truth and information, and I put that in quotation marks, free to distort, misinform, and skew all information to their financial or ideological benefit, by the way, without any repercussions, really, because of their government indirect appointments. Do you remember Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a Russian who was persecuted for truth-telling? He said that the press has become the greatest power in the Western world, more than legislative, executive, or judiciary. The power of the pen. By whom were these people elected, and to whom are they responsible? And that is a good question that we need to ask today. There was a law in 1996, it was called the Telecommunications Act, which was supposed to protect us from the media takeover, and yet it did exactly the opposite. And don't journalists, we are told, have the obligation to divulge information they have discovered? I mean, isn't that what freedom of press is really for? Well, George Orwell, who wrote the book 1984, who really was an insider who understood some of these things and then became very uncomfortable about it and decided he better tell about it, and he did in the book. He said, during times of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. John Swinton, former chief of staff at the New York Times, said this. He said, there is no such thing as an independent press in America. That's pretty sad. Commentator Michael Savage said in a speech to the San Francisco Commonwealth Club in 1998, beware the government media complex. C-SPAN refused to cover it. Now, how far from the original intent of our Creator and the unalienable rights and the original intent of our founding fathers we have fallen. Things like that show us just how far. So there is an unseen censorship which happens through intimidation and the threat of lost privileges or more dire circumstances. That's really what happens when rights are not fought for, secured, and faithfully, diligently maintained. And remember this, truth is the mortal enemy of lies. The globalists, such as the Council for Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergers, the United Nations, and many others, do not want freedom of press. Such as David Rockefeller have admitted that they have an agenda, which includes the destruction of the sovereignty of the American Republic. And this is not a conspiracy theory, people, as some people would like you to think. We have the documentation and documents to prove that these people said that and they really meant what they said. It's un-American, it's an unrighteous agenda, and it's being proven, even to the detriment of those who are proving it, just as King George III did to those who opposed him in the years surrounding the establishment of this republic. So the First Amendment, in fact, all of our foundational documents, were intended to protect we the people from the demonic lust of some men for power over other men. Now, who would voluntarily relinquish these rights? And their associated freedoms, of course, that were fought for by our founding fathers and many others throughout our life as a nation. So let's just say, in conclusion, what can be done to reverse this wrong? Because a lot of people always ask me, well, I want to hear action points. And so I don't just report information, I do bring to you action points. So what can be done to reverse this wrong which has been done to us? Well, the scope of today's teaching is out of necessity very limited. I must trust that even as the Holy Spirit inspired the apostles and the believers in the early New Testament church and the Reformation to fight against the ecclesiastical tyranny of those times, and as he inspired the founders of America to stand against a tyrannical king and civil magistrate, King George III, in those times, that we will stand against the erosion of our precious rights and freedoms today. And that is certainly my prayer, my desire, and what I am personally working towards. It is a revival in America and a restoration of what America is all about. So what can you do? Well, by investing in and supporting our or founding of truth-telling and independent media sources. Yes, you might start something like that. By using every means at your personal disposal, such as legitimate commercial persuasion. What do I mean about that? Cancel my subscription. Don't support some of these news media. Or something like remove my cable or I'll not buy or support that. By educating others through websites, personally distributed literature, tapes, CDs, DVDs, and by the way, anyone that sees me in any of the events that I speak in, I bring a lot of materials along. I distribute them everywhere I go so that people will learn. And today we can do that through, as I said, tapes, DVDs, and brochures, whatever. And this is in no way an exhaustive list. I'm just giving you sort of a primer here. Remember that Thomas Paine's Common Sense was about 30 pages long. It was widely distributed and contributed greatly to the war for American independence success. Your publication could even be not even 30 pages long, and maybe even a great success, because it could still create a revival of truth and effective action in our nation. You might even be a constitutionalist, and this is, I could give you a long list, but this is one I want you to think about. If you understand that the job of government is to protect and secure God-given rights, not to use its power to take those rights away. And as the Declaration of American Independence states most emphatically, I believe, before the signatures of those 56 fine Christian truth-tellers were put to that charter, with the pledge, and it says this, with the pledge of their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, they said this. And I'd sign it and say it myself today. With a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, who they identified as Christ, I challenge you to do the same and see America restored to the Founder's vision, the Creator's vision, before the opportunity passes. And John Wesley, who's the founder of Methodism, said in 1775, "Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, at all the times that you can, to all the people you can, as long as you can." The Patriot charge, and I give you this today as you're watching this video. Semper vigilio paritus et fidelis. That's a Latin phrase drawn from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2, which means always vigilant, prepared, and faithful. And finally, this blessing that I give you today comes from the 4th chapter, verse 23 of Proverbs. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. I will have no other king but King Jesus.